Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about writing choices and stylistic characteristics that tend to characterize academic writing and college writing as opposed to less formal writing and, let's say, writing in high school. So what I'm going to be talking about right now is not necessarily going to be do this or don't do this, but some things you want to watch out for, especially if you tend to do many of these things as a habit, or if you find yourself doing a lot of these things on a particular paper. Now, just as a kind of caveat, a lot of these particular types of stylistic choices are going to be more relevant for argumentative papers, papers that are structured around evidence as opposed to personal response papers or papers that are based specifically around an opinion that isn't evidence based or an experiential paper. So this isn't going to be as relevant to papers that are basically based in types of evidence that aren't, let's say, textual evidence or are really based in sort of personal opinion or personal experience. So keep that in mind. Occasionally you will have assignments that ask you for a personal opinion or ask you to relate an experience. Some of these, you'll be able to tell which ones. Some of these particular pieces of advice aren't really going to work for those types of assignments. But in general, these are going to be pieces of advice that are useful for all types of formal writing in particular, including some professional writing outside of college and for college writing. So this is basically a sort of lesson that is linked to, in my class, a document that you will see in, I think, week 4 that says tips for college writing, but I'm giving it to you now because we do have a rough draft coming up. So I thought it might be useful to you as you're thinking about putting that paper together. So what I'm going to be talking about is a series of tips and pieces of advice. And instead of making a bunch of do's and do nots, to me, it seems more reasonable to talk to you about why, the kind of explanation for why these types of norms have developed in this community. So again, not to belabor a point, but this is going to be really based in that kind of norm system of the idea that academia is about being skeptical but open-minded. So again, this is about you demonstrating that you are making a point that is based in evidence, that you are not expecting your reader to take something on your own word only, but that you're backing it up with evidence that logically supports the point that you're making. So a lot of these are going to be based in that. So if you keep that in mind, I suspect that a lot of these are going to make sense. Others are really about style. Okay, and so you'll kind of see how that works out. So let me, for this first section, I definitely want to make sure that we share screen because it's going to be very, very wordy. So let's do that right now. Okay, so this section here, words and phrases to avoid using. I want you again to take this with a grain of salt. These are not bad words, but they're words that when you find yourself using them, you want to pause and you want to be thinking about what exactly you're using them for. This set of words are words that often come when you are, as a writer, displaying bias that comes before the text that isn't based in evidence from the text, where you are writing with a lack of nuance rather than writing analytically. So this is where you say agree, disagree, often where this is you saying that you disagree or agree as opposed to analyzing, where you say something is correct or incorrect, valid or invalid, real, fake, right, wrong, true, false, natural, unnatural, normal, abnormal. In each of these cases, what's usually happening here is you have a preconceived notion that may not be adequately explained to the reader and may not be based in evidence. It's something that you brought to the text. It isn't coming out of the text. And then you're expecting the reader to already share that that sense of right and wrong, or what's quote unquote normal or natural, and you're just kind of expecting them to go along with that, as opposed to developing an argument. So if they don't already agree with that, you've already lost them from the beginning. This last section, I think, feel, believe, that's usually a pretty big red flag that whatever follows isn't actually going to be supported by evidence. You're just basically hoping that the strength of your feelings is going to pull along your reader, okay, rather than evidence. So you're basically breaking that contract of being open-minded but skeptical, right? You're just hoping that you'll get that open-minded section, but not the skeptical section. So when you find yourself dropping into that I think, I feel, I believe, slow down, look at that section really carefully, and make sure that this isn't a moment where you're jettisoning the necessity for evidence in your argument. That's usually a really big red flag. All right, so let's move from this section to another section of words that I would say are a little bit less red flag and maybe a little bit more yellow flag. If you've got a lot of them, we could be easing into orange flag territory, but these are words that can be useful, but are often used in ways that convey vagueness or a kind of lack of specificity unless you clarify with a modifying word. So often we'll have sentences that say something like, there are many similarities between A and B. And then the writer doesn't actually specify what those similarities are. At that point, you haven't actually said anything. So unless that sentence says, for example, X, Y, and Z, you haven't really fulfilled your contract with your reader. So you want to be very careful when you have these words that might make you feel like you've provided content, but actually are sort of empty containers, that you specify, that you clarify, that you explain. If you say that there are many facets, that there are many factors, that there are many ways or issues, that you then immediately follow up with saying what factors, what issues, what ways, because otherwise you've sort of teased us, but you haven't actually fed us. You haven't really explained what it is that what you've sort of dangled in front of us. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Again, these words aren't bad, but they're ones that you might want to put in your search function, and then just double check and make sure that whenever you use them, you clarify what kinds of ways, what kinds of factors, what kinds of differences, etc. Okay. The last section of words that I would say yellow flag, can be orange flag, especially if you see a cluster of them. These are what I call insisting words. Often we have insisting words in places where people tend to emphasize something is true because they want to put pressure on a point where they don't have adequate support. So then they're like, no, really, it's really, really true, because they don't have anything to back it up. So they push on it really hard. So words like obviously, very, surely, evidently, undeniably. If it's evident, if it's undeniable, if it's obvious, you probably don't need to tell the reader that it is evident, undeniable, or obvious, right? Because your evidence should have already shown that. So usually people tend to use these words when they're actually a little bit nervous, or they're a little bit insecure about the state of their evidence. It's usually, it's like, here's a mushy part in my paper and I'm feeling a little bit sensitive about it. So that's actually, when you have a draft, is actually a great warning to yourself that maybe you want to take a look at that section a little bit more closely. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and let's talk about a couple of other common issues that crop up that are not necessarily deal breakers, but are usually not the best way to go about your business. Number one is something I call dictionary dependency. It's really common in papers where people will kind of look at that empty screen and not know where to start. And a really common thing that students do in the beginning of papers is they start with a dictionary definition of a significant term in the paper. This is actually really generally not a great move to make. And there's a couple of different reasons. One, in academics, as you've probably already noticed, often words are used in your readings in really specific contextualized ways. So a dictionary definition is often going to look like a way to dodge the text itself. And it's very often going to be a definition that isn't actually going to be quite appropriate to the text as you read it. So for example, I have often in the past taught a text that uses this term disinterested as a kind of key term. The way the author is using the term disinterested is in the 19th century sense of somebody doing something in a way that is without regard to their own self-interest. So in an unselfish kind of ethical way. So that might come as a surprise to somebody who looks up the word disinterested in the dictionary. And since it's usually going to prioritize the most common usage of the word, it's probably going to say uninterested. And so if somebody makes that dictionary move, they're probably going to misrepresent a key term in the text and in their own paper because they've kind of done the sidestep at the beginning. Similarly, in our own class, we often talk about the term power. And one of the things that often happens is we end up having to talk about the different kinds of ways that power might mean, or the ways that class can be used differently in different contexts, or the way that we talk about argument differently in different social or professional contexts, and how it can mean different things. So the same word means different things in different contexts. So running to a dictionary is almost always not going to be a great move. The exception to this is going to be if you are working on a historical project of some kind, then going to a historical dictionary like the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll often hear us call it the OED, like we're chums, and then kind of excavating what a word meant at the time of a particular text you're talking about. That might not be a terrible move, especially if the word is important to the text or central to your reading of the text. Then that kind of move isn't terrible. But generally, it's not a great move in other types of argumentative texts. So that's one thing to just kind of watch out for. Another thing to look out for is the first and second person address. So what I mean by this is when you use you, we, us, or I in a paper. Now, these are not inherently problems. If you've ever had a teacher who's like, don't use the word I just want to talk to you for a few minutes about why that probably is. And I'm not going to tell you not to use the words, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the risk factors just so that you're aware, which makes this sound much more dramatic than it is, but such is life. Okay, so the real issue with you, we, and us is that it often presumes a lot about your reader that you can't know. And so this can cause problems. when you presume, if you say something about we experience this, your reader may not in fact experience the thing that you describe. Or if you say we know this, your reader may in fact not know or agree with you, with the premise that you're setting out. So when you use the word we, it can often have a kind of coercive sense to it, that you are making presumptions about your reader, or that you are basically presuming agreement from your reader that you can't actually assume that you have. And so in particular, if your reader does not agree with the thing you just said they did, you can basically lose them from a rhetorical standpoint. They can be hostile to you and to your argument from that point on. So that kind of you slash we slash us move is just generally rhetorically risky. And often you just don't have the kind of warrant to make those presumptions about your reader. In academia, you generally don't know who's going to be reading your text. And so since you don't have control over that, that type of presumption, the presumption of sameness with your reader, the presumption that you know what they think or what they've experienced, and that you can just kind of make that claim of sameness, is generally very risky, and you might as well not do it. There's just no reason to take that risk. Similarly, I've already kind of touched on this. When you tend to lean on the I, it generally comes up at points when the writer is relying on personal anecdote or opinion rather than textual support. So it's often a kind of red flag that you're moving away from the kind of work that's going to be rewarded in an argumentative paper that's being based on textual support. So I'm not going to tell you not to use I, because there are places where it's appropriate. And especially as sometimes second examples, there are places where it's not necessarily going to hurt your argument, but you want to be careful when you find yourself using I and leaning into I, that what isn't happening is that your paper, you don't want your paper to be suddenly moving away from evidence and leaning really hard into personal opinion. That's basically the thing that you want to look out for. If you find yourself basically saying, we have this happen to us as your claims, what I would recommend you do is move away from we or I or us, and instead talk about individuals have this happen, or this happens to people. So what you want to do is, instead of specifying yourself or individuals in general, or sorry, the reader, what you want to do then is then talk about people as a class. So individuals, society, one, people, etc. That way, if what you're trying to do is just use the general you avoid upsetting the reader if that general you doesn't include them. I hope that made sense. Okay, so just in general, avoid I, you, we, us. And at least, you don't necessarily have to cut those out of your vocabulary, but check out those sections, especially in revision, and make sure that those sections aren't either making claims you can't back up, or indicating a kind of sameness with your reader that you can't really be sure of. Okay. If you're not sure whether or not you're doing that, you can always check in with me. Okay, this one's really easy. It's short, but in academic writing, the kind of rule of thumb is that academic writing is formal writing, so you want to avoid contractions. So instead of saying isn't, you'd say is not. Instead of can't, you'd say cannot, and so on. It's just one of those little norms of academic writing. Most of your teachers are probably not going to pitch a fit about this, but it's one of those things that shows that you know that you're writing in a formal way. As a side note, this is also a convention of other types of formal writing, like if you're ever writing a cover letter for a job, same rules apply. You want to write very formally. If you ever want to think about the kind of formality of your letter writing or your paper writing here, and you have ever written a cover letter, same kind of rules apply. You're writing in a in a kind of professional context. So those same kinds of levels of formality apply in both cases. Okay. So now I'm going to kind of have a bit of transition into types of statements that are generally that you want to avoid in academic writing. Number one, you want to avoid, and this is something that has come up a lot in the last, I would say 5 years. In general, you want to avoid statements of what we call relatability. A statement of relatability is something like, I really related to this character, or I really related to the author when they said blah, 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 blah. In a personal response, that makes perfect sense. That's, that is about your response. So you talking about relating to someone, completely appropriate. But in an analytical paper, your sense of kind of relatability, the sense that you identified with either a character or the author or someone who's being described in an example, doesn't actually tell us anything. It doesn't help us analyze the text. It just tells us something about you, which isn't typically what an assignment is asking us to do in an analytical paper. So just be aware of that while it's very common for people to write that in papers lately, that's really something that might belong in a discussion board or in a response paper, but not in an analytical paper where you're making an argument. It's just a different kind of statement. It isn't helping us to understand the text better. It's just helping us to understand you better. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so one major category of statement that students often have trouble with in academic writing and in argumentative writing is moralizing. And often when I try to talk to students about moralizing, they say, so are you saying I can't talk about my own point of view, or I can't talk about my own opinions? And this always gets a little bit dicey because you can, but with very specific boundaries or within certain frameworks. So in academic writing, any claim you make must be supported by evidence. So by definition, an unsupported opinion isn't going to be rewarded within that framework. Moralizing in general is going to take the form of something like a platitude or a generalization. And those are kinds of statements that can be made without ever having read the texts, or they're often made as if they're truths that don't need any support or any evidence. And that's really what makes them problematic in an argumentative essay. So to make this a little bit less abstract and a little bit more direct, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of forms that moralizing often can take in a paper. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay, so relativistic statements. So an example of this might be something like, every individual sees things differently, so no one can say what's really right or wrong. I get at least 5 papers that say this, sometimes even in the thesis. No one can know what really happened. No one can know what's really wrong. No one can really tell because every example is different or every person is different. Okay, you've successfully dodged answering the question, but unfortunately, since you needed to actually answer the question to do the assignment, now you've got a real problem. Okay, so you want to avoid relativistic statements. Pleas for multicultural harmony, well, we would love to have multicultural harmony, are generally not going to actually be analyzing anything, because what you're really doing is you're appealing to people's better nature rather than actually analyzing the evidence in front of you. Okay, so why can't we get along? Racism is evil. We need better communication. Like all of these can be true, but chances are when you're saying these things, you aren't doing so with reference to evidence. It's sort of more a cry from the heart. Okay, so you want to make sure that when you're making statements, that they are something that is based in the evidence from your texts rather than kind of a statement of values. Okay. Celebrating and demonizing. This can refer to all kinds of things. So it can be about the author, the style of writing. Sometimes I get a lot of that, especially early in the semester, and everyone's still got that kind of shock of having to read academic prose, which is not always the most fun to read. Or it could be referring to people in the texts, people who are being described in the texts, some of the characters from the examples. Kind of going off on a rant about the author or their writing style or a character, you know, obviously being evil because they're a slave master, you know, that's fairly easy. But what it generally tends to do is take you away from the analysis that the questions, the assignment questions are asking you to do. So you want to make sure that you kind of avoid going off on these tangents that can sometimes be very satisfying, right? Save that for discussion boards or class discussion, but it's actually going to hurt you in your papers because it's going to take your focus away from your argumentation. Okay. Also, you know, suggesting that a writer's style of communicating is, you know, too complicated, boring, etc., isn't actually an academic analysis, right? It's an editorial comment. I agree with you. Sometimes it is absolutely warranted. They deserve it. Sometimes we could all stand to be a little bit clearer in our writings, even published authors. But it's not analysis. It's sometimes a justified complaint, but it doesn't belong there. It belongs, let's say, in class discussion. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing for a couple minutes so that we can move away from that. But what I would also say is the other way that you can also tell some forms of moralization in general, if you find yourself using words like right, wrong, good, evil, should, or shouldn't. Shouldn't is a really big tell. If you find yourself slipping into that type of language, there's a good chance that you're moralizing. And this is a great chance to email me or to drop into office hours if you're like, I'm not sure whether or not this crosses the line into moralizing rather than arguing, or how do I take this moralizing and can I develop it into argument? Because sometimes it's just it's a case of reframing where you're saying it's right or wrong, but what you're really saying is this is damaging to, let's say, identity because, and we just need to reframe it so that it stops being moralizing and moves into argumentation. We can do that. But sometimes you need a nudge from someone else who isn't quite as close to your paper. That's a great use of office hours or of peer review. So just be aware, especially if you find yourself falling into that language of should or shouldn't, you are almost certainly falling into moralizing. So you probably want to move away from that. The other really big category that really marks that kind of shift from informal to formal writing, or we could say from high school writing to college writing. And it will often drive your professors absolutely bonkers. But sometimes we have a little bit of trouble finding ways to articulate exactly what the issue is this kind of large umbrella of what we call presumption. And there are different categories of presumption, but all of them have to do with you either claiming implicitly knowledge that isn't demonstrated in the paper, or acting as if something is true that is actually not true. And it causes a couple of different argumentative problems in your paper. One, it makes claims that don't have evidence. And so if you think about the whole premise of an academic paper is you can make any kind of claim as long as there is a logical basis for it that is supported by evidence. You sort of break the contract with your reader. So you've got a problem with that norm right off the bat. The other kind of problem that it creates is it makes you look less credible, right? If you make what are basically wild or unfounded claims, your reader right off the bat basically is given not only no reason to trust you, they're given a reason not to trust you. So that kind of effort that the reader puts through, puts into reading your essay starts to feel like wasted effort, right? And you don't want that kind of resentment on the part of your reader who's just like, why am I putting this effort in when you aren't even supporting your argument, or when you're making these kinds of wild, unbased claims, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of the forms of presumption that are most common, that most commonly appear in academic writing. Okay, so the number one form that we tend to see really frequently, and this is probably going to hurt some people, but I'm going to share the screen here, is the presumption of historical knowledge. And we call this Olympian Statements. I actually had to make the font a little bit smaller so that we could see all of these at once. So we call these Olympian Statements because it's as if you know Mount Olympus, this is in Greek mythology, this is the mountain that the gods were said to stand upon and look down upon humanity from, and they could see all of the world from Mount Olympus. An Olympian statement is a statement that attempts to encompass huge amounts of human history in a single statement. And it is almost always totally bogus. Okay, so what often happens, this usually happens at the beginning or in the introduction or in the conclusion. It's most common in the introduction, and I have a sneaking personal suspicion that this is an unintended consequence of a very frequently given piece of advice that introductions should start broad and get narrow. And how could you get any broader, really, than saying something like from the dawn of time? However, the problem is that if you think about the way that academic writing is based in the idea of make a claim and then back it up with why should I or any reasonable person believe this, basically almost any claim that is an Olympian statement, you can't back it up within the space of an assignment. And the reality is that Olympian statements aren't really meant, there's never any intention to back it up, right? If you think about something like through the ages, which ages, right? Since the dawn of time, how many books would you have to insert into your paper before you could comfortably feel that you had actually supported whatever the end of that sentence is going to be? The reality is you were never going to back that up with evidence. You weren't going to include all of the footnotes. You weren't going to write those books. And how many years would it take you to do so? And how many people might you need to actually do that? So the problem with these statements is they're writing checks that your paper isn't going to cash, and you never intended to. It's a bounced check. So generally, they come off feeling pretty immature, and they come off feeling kind of disingenuous. Now, I absolutely understand that, 9 times out of 10, these are basically starter sentences that feel like throwaway sentences, or they feel like something that is super, super obvious to you as you're writing them. However, you're going to run into problems because 1, they're going to feel very amateurish to your reader, and 2, very frequently, they include vast generalizations about human nature or about history that actually aren't true. So what you basically do when you write these sentences is you encourage your reader to be like, well, actually, I can think about, these 3 or 4 exceptions off the top of my head. This is kind of bogus. Why should I listen to you about anything? Okay, so you really want to avoid these. These, by the way, are all taken from actual papers. I cannot tell you how many of your professors probably have. It's like their little sanity file where they just collect these and they keep them like a little personal exorcism because they make our spines twitch. But I swear to you, please, 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 when you find yourself writing these sentences, go back and then rewrite and reframe so that you aren't trying to make a huge historical claim. So if you're saying, since the dawn of time, this has all, I can't even make one of these statements. It just runs counter to everything in me. But if you find yourself basically saying, since the dawn of time, X has been true, the chances are whatever X is, whether it's about gender, whether it's about power, whether it's about how one group treats another group, what you're really interested in is actually the second part of that sentence. Start with the second part of the sentence and chop off the historical claim that you can't back up. So make that thing the core of your sentence, make that the subject of your sentence. And even if you still make a generalization, you might say something like X has long been a subject of conversation and debate. That's much less of a claim that you can't back up. Okay. And you're going to look a lot less like someone who is comfortable making unwarranted claims. I hope that makes sense. I hope nobody's feeling awkward or anything. But if your draft has one of these statements in there, you've got a real quick, easy fix that is going to make both you and me feel a lot better about it much quicker. Okay, other kinds of presumptions. We've already sort of talked about this when we talked about first person and second person issues, but presumption of cultural sameness covers a lot of ground. So this is when you make a claim assuming that your reader has the same background and or view of your claim as you do. So this can cause all kinds of problems in terms not only of the text, but also in terms of your sort of bond with your reader. And sometimes you can actually be quite unintentionally offensive to your reader. A good example of this came almost 20 years ago in one of my classes. There was a paper that was written about voting rights, and a student wrote, since the founding of our nation, we have unfortunately moved away from the egalitarian ideals that served our forefathers so well. One, this assumes that whoever reads this is also an American citizen, which is patently not necessarily true. Two, historically, all kinds of issues. One, in the United States, voting was not during the time of the founding fathers in any way carried out on egalitarian ideals. You had to be a white male landowner. So whose forefathers were actually served well by this? And why would you assume that your readers would feel the same way about that and might not feel some kind of way about being told that this was actually a great deal, right? Okay, so I hope that makes sense. But basically, presumption of historical sameness or cultural sameness carries with it many problems. And often, again, it's going to be a sentence that you're not even thinking about the fact that it's actually a minefield. Okay, so you want to be super, super careful. You'll notice that part of the issue here is our and we, right, is all over that sentence. And not surprisingly, that sentence is a mess on several levels. Okay. I hope that this helps. I hope this isn't going to make you all nervous, but these are some of the most common ways that college papers run into problems of evidence, problems of support, and then problems that we might call of just uh, excessive informality. Um, so the handout is there for you. There are a couple of extra like little stylistic things in there as well, but it's there. It's formatted a little bit differently than I laid it out here, but I just wanted to give a little bit of explanation for each of those sections because I don't know about you, but for me, if I just had a sheet of do's and do nots, it's not going to stick with me. It's not going to make sense for me. And I'm going to be like, well, you can't tell me what to do. So I hope that that at least makes that handout a little bit more sensible, and hopefully the content's a little bit more memorable and helpful to you. So take care, and I'll see you in class.